Thank you all for coming to our first forum on Integrated Naval History and Sea Power Studies, or FINS event of this semester. Thank you to the mids who did make it today, as opposed to all those who appear to be still stuck in King Hall. Maybe they'll wander in a little bit later. Today, we're having our first event of what we expect to be 3 this semester. Next month in October, Dr. Gina Akers will be joining us from the Naval History and Heritage Command to talk about women sailors in World War I, and to talk about a book that she recently published on the subject for our first Bell lecture. But today we're glad to have Commander Bryan McGrath with us to talk about the Cooperative Strategy for 21st Century Seapower. This September marks the 15th anniversary of the release of CS-21, which was the first joint strategic document between the U.S. Navy, U.S. Marine Corps, and U.S. Coast Guard together really since World War II. In 2007, the strategy aimed to prepare the nation for the coming century and a maritime view of it, as well as thinking about then nascent threats like the rise of China, all while American land forces continued to fight counterinsurgency operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Today, Commander McGrath who was deeply involved in the research and writing of the strategy, is going to allow us to tap into his wide experience both in uniform and after retirement in naval strategic affairs, and to help us remember CS-21 in a historical sense, but also think about it in our naval present. Bryan McGrath is a retired surface warfare officer. His final sea tour was in command of USS BULKELEY, DDG-84, and his final shore tour was as team lead and lead author of the 2007 Maritime Strategy, a Cooperative Strategy for 21st Century Seapower. He's a 1987 graduate of the University of Virginia with a BA in History, and a 1999 graduate of Catholic University with an MA in Political Science. So please join me in welcoming Bryan. So today is one of our Seapower Scuttlebutt events. So Bryan and I will have a conversation over a couple of questions that I've prepared in advance, and hopefully it'll spark some interest from you. And about halfway through our meeting together, I'll open it up to the floor for a discussion and a Q&A from you guys in the audience. So Bryan, I'll start with your Navy biography, which tells us about the jobs you've had in your time as a surface warfare officer, your command. It's all befitting of a naval man of action. Can you tell us a little bit about how your education shaped your understanding of being a naval officer and of sea power?
Education, training, different, right? We all try to make sure we keep those things separate. Education itself, formal, on the job. A lot of on-the-job education in my career. I got hired to come to Washington and write this strategy in 2006 or whenever it was. I'd never read a page of Alfred Thayer Mahan at the time. Not a page. What I was a surface warfare officer who thought strategically because of the nature of my job. I walked into CIC as a lieutenant on the USS Thomas S. Gates, cruiser number 51, and there were 4 large command and control screens at any one time that were laying out the situational awareness for me. One of them was always on 256 miles. There aren't a whole lot of O3s in the military whose AOR, whose responsibility goes out to 256 miles. But I would walk in, and because of the nature of the NTDS symbology and what was on the screen, in like 3 seconds, I knew what was happening 256 miles around me in the skies. That kind of thinking on the job about the strategic nature of what we do and how large an area a naval force can influence, very important. I'm going to get to formal education, I promise you. On-the-job education again. I went for 3 years to the Joint Staff to be the interoperability officer on the J8 staff. After 3 years there, I was a systems engineer. I'm a history major, for heaven's sake, right? I mean, but at the end of that tour, I was thinking end-to-end functionality. I was thinking through problems in a way that was very different than I started in that job. So when I show up for my strategy writing job, I'm thinking like a systems engineer. And I'm thinking like a history major. And I'm thinking like a political science major, right? I went to the Catholic University at night. My degree says political science, but it was congressional studies. I spent 1.5 years elbows deep in learning how the Congress works. Specifically, how the Congress works with the military. That education at Catholic University in how the Congress and the military interrelate was essential to how I led the strategy team a few years later. It's essential to the work I do now to understand that very little of the work that Congress does, and it does an immense amount of work, but very little of the work that you see ever happens on television. It's all happening in committees, more specifically in committee staffs. And if you want to get something done, you got to know the staffers, and you got to influence them, and you got to talk them through things. So my education, formal education at UVA and Catholic, formal education at the Naval War College and JPME Phase 1, and on-the-job education, all came together in one job, really, and that was the strategy writing job. It was a place where my operational time led to the inescapable conclusion that fleets means something strategically, that naval forces signal and message routinely to an extent that our friends in other forces never do. It convinced me that what we do in peacetime is essential to this republic. We have incredibly important warfighting responsibilities, but what we do when there's no shooting going on is cosmically important. We'll probably talk about that later, but the education that led to those conclusions helped me in that final job writing strategy.
So to kind of follow up on that, as a history major, we often hear that here in the 21st century, things are accelerating faster than they ever have before, that technology has changed so much with cyber and space and all the new developments, and it's so fast and it's so aggressive that history really isn't useful to us anymore. How do you see the role of understanding the past in both the naval profession, but also in the construction of strategy more widely?
I guess the first thing I would say is that your sort of prelude to that question just drives me nuts, because I think human beings have uniqueness bias, right? We all think that what we're facing today is orders of magnitude more difficult than anyone else in human history has ever faced. It's not true. I don't know what the proof is, but we think it, right? And because of that uniqueness bias, we tend to glom onto the squirrel running through the room, right? Cyber, electronic warfare, whatever it might be at that moment, when I think there remains an incredibly important mandate to go back to first things. You want to learn a new idea, read an old book. I just tweeted that the other day. I stole it from somebody really smart. I don't know who it was, but I was thinking about application of naval forces when I wrote that on Twitter. So, the study of history, the study of the past, the study of lessons learned, the studies of lessons not learned, more importantly, will never go away in importance. It doesn't mean I think everybody needs to be a history major or a generalist. I like the fact that my heart doctor is a specialist in heart surgery. But the world is big enough for generalists and specialists, and a proper Navy has a place for all of them.
So we mentioned before that you were kind of not just the lead author, but kind of organizer of the construction of the 2007 strategy. So before we talk a little bit about the actual content of what's in the strategy, can you talk us through a little bit about how strategy gets made, whether specifically in this case of the 2007 document, or more generally in the American kind of national security space? How does this work?
Yeah, every strategy is different, but there are certain steps in the process of making strategy that I think are repeatable and repeated. The first is determining, do you have standing to make a strategy, to write a strategy, right? There was a great deal of consternation in and around the Navy staff in 2005 and 2006 as to whether the making of strategy at the service chief level was even a realistic or an appropriate pursuit. Strategy's made by the Joint Staff and the COCOMs, where you just make budgets. That's all. And it is true, by the way. The Navy staff has one job, and that is to make a budget. But if you're going to make a budget, it needs to be informed by something. And John Morgan, the 3-star that owned me back then, used to say, "Show me your budget, and I'll show you my strategy." So the repeatable parts of strategy making include, number one, do you have standing to write one? Number two, who is your audience? That's always important. Generally speaking, at the level I was writing, we were trying to aim at Congress. We were trying to aim at the broader maritime community internationally. If this is 2005, 2006, we weren't aiming at any adversaries at the time. I mean, there was a French diplomat who referred to us at that point as a hyperpower. We won the Cold War. We were atop the ash heap, standing on the ash heap that was the Warsaw Pact. We weren't thinking about signaling to adversaries like the famous maritime strategy of the 1980s was clearly aiming at our adversaries as one of their audiences. So it's, you determine your audience, you determine what do you want to say, and a lot of that comes out of a research phase, of a reflection phase. First 6 months of our effort was really centered up at the Naval War College, where they had a series of workshops and conferences designed to sort of turn the soil over. Intelligence, strategy, grand strategy, how grand strategy affects the making of military strategy, that sort of stuff. So we had this period of reflection. Then you have to decide who your partners are, and Commander Armstrong made it very clear that our strategy brought the Coast Guard on board for the first time in anyone's memory. The strategy of the 1980s was Navy and Marine Corps only. We brought the Coast Guard in. Once you have your team, you've got 3 services then that have to buy in. And what we did was we said each service is going to create its own process for getting their service chief's signature. I worked with my boss, Admiral Morgan, to work with the CNO to determine how we would get his sign-in. There are formal processes in the Pentagon that get CNO approval of things. I did not like any of them, and I did not wish to be bound by any of them, and so we made one up that I got Admiral Morgan to buy, and I got the CNO, 2 CNOs to buy, because we switched over in the middle. And it was all about speed. It was meeting a deadline that I had set for me, and I said, well, if you want me to meet the deadline, we got to go fast. So you have a process. You have how do I get the CNO's signature? The most important step, though, is the vetting. We had to send this out for several rounds of vetting. We had the international the naval attaché community took a look at it, and we got some feedback from them. We got several rounds of flag officer input. I personally walked this thing around to the thought shops of the other services. to get their input. We took all this input in, and we adjudicated it on an adjudication matrix. And anytime I had to tell somebody with 4 stars no, I had to go brief that to the CNO and get the CNO to say, I agree with you, say no to that person. So once you get that all locked down, then the final step is distribution. What kind of show are you going to have? What kind of event are you going to have to bring this thing out there? And then how do you keep it from just becoming another document on the shelf? I think those are the steps in any strategy that you have to make in Washington.
Which one was the hardest one in this process?
The hardest one. The easiest one was the writing of the strategy. I was living in a world, it was like a COVID world in 2005. I would just say, I'm going to go home and write. And I'd go home and write, and I'd bring what I'd written, 5 pages or whatever, in, and it would go up on a screen, and a Coast Guard captain, or a Coast Guard captain, a Marine Corps colonel, teams, and we would sit there and we'd just go line by line, and my soul was getting crushed with every. But then I'd go home and I'd write some more, and I did all my work at my computer on my kitchen table. Kind of sounds like COVID, but the hardest step was the adjudication, because we brought an incredible number of really smart people who really had important opinions and sometimes agendas that they wanted to fit in. And again, I had an idea of a central principle in this thing that I sold to everybody, that I sold all the way up through the chain, and it was making it. And then some 3-star in East Jabip has some 05 who's making a comment that wants to take us back to square one, and I have to find a way to bring that person along. So it was the adjudication process was the hardest.
Sounds like peer review and strategy making is just as painful for academics.
I think you're right. I think you're right.
So when the strategy came out in 2007, it talked a lot, frankly, about peace. And in fact, there seemed to be some criticism to some of the comments, and I'm going to quote here, that, quote, preventing wars is as important as winning wars, unquote, which sounds uncontroversial, but there was still criticism of that from some naval people who wanted to believe that the focus should be on the wars and the winning of wars. Can you talk a little bit about that and what both the content, what you were trying to say about peace in the content, but also then what that experience was like after the strategy came out, the feedback came in?
So in the inquiry phase, turning over the soil, Admiral Morgan and I went up to Manhattan, and we went and sat with a few investment banks, their strategists. Just talking things over, and we wanted to find out about what they considered the preconditions for security and commerce and prosperity and all those sorts of things. It was a good exchange. Morgan and I are in the back of a car driving somewhere, and he has this moment where he says, it's just amazing to me that the 20th century was the century with the most economic progress in the history of mankind, and it was also the bloodiest century in history. And I'm sitting there wrestling with that because it's a true statement to a point, and then I realized what the point was, and I said, Admiral, those two things happened in different halves of the century. And that's where the central idea for the Maritime Strategy, Cooperative Strategy 21st Century Seapower came out, which was we created a system. We created a global system of security, information, the movement of people, the movement of ideas, the movement of commerce. We created a global system that had contributed to world stability and peace. Naval forces, maritime forces, play a disproportionate role in the maintenance, sustainment, and advancement of that system. That was the central idea of the strategy. It wasn't, we're going to go kick your butt. I think that was included in the thinking, but we were writing at a time, again, where the Soviets had been defeated, where French were referring to us as a hyperpower, where Admiral Mullen, who was the CNO and then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, had talked about a 1,000-ship Navy. There was this sense that we may have created something that was really important to keep going and keep the plates spinning. That wasn't popular with a lot of people who wanted to see a little bit more of a harder edge in the strategy. I will tell you that I don't think the word strike is in the strategy anywhere. That statement, preventing war is as important as winning war, was really controversial. Not with me. I thought it made sense, right? Isn't that why we pack ourselves up and go 3,000 miles away and sail around for 6 months and then come home again without shooting at anybody? We're trying to prevent war. We're trying to keep a lid on things. We're trying to keep a place where the plates are spinning and commerce is moving and American people are being enriched and they're getting the products they need, and all of this was happening. And guess what? It's not just we who were benefiting from that. It was everybody who bought into that. Everybody who thinks that was important was benefiting from that. Now, the strategy gets written, it gets out, just before it comes out, the Chinese shot a missile at a satellite and exploded it in space. Like weeks before the strategy came out. And I wondered to myself, and I eventually wrote in 2009, I wondered to myself at that moment, holy moly, did we write something that is obsolete the minute it was printed? 2009, I wrote, yeah, I think we need to move this away from this. We need to make it a little harder edge. The central ideas, I thought, remained coherent and reasonable, but we needed to get a harder edge and a little bit more of a kinetic feel back into it, and that's what strategy makers had done since. Now, one final thing. I came here and spoke to a class last year, and they were studying maritime strategy, and I read a bunch of, and the students had read the strategy, and I was shocked by how positive they found it. And what they were doing was applying its principles to the world they're seeing today, in this sense of preventing war, in this sense of a global system that's working to things. And they renewed my sense that maybe we didn't get it quite so bad in 2006.
Well, that kind of leads me to what I was thinking was going to be my last question, and that is, so here we are 15 years later. You said, maybe 2 or 3 years later, you thought, yeah, maybe we were OBE. But now here we are 15 years later. What do you think? How does it stand up?
I think it stands up well, and I think its emphasis on what we do in peacetime to deter war and to assure allies is incredibly important. So important that I think we have in this dialogue, and you write about this, and I write about this, and Hendricks writes about this, and all these people who drink our own bathwater and write about naval strategy, we're all trying to say that it isn't just, we shouldn't just be worried about what happens once the shooting starts, although that is very important. And quite frankly, the analysis and campaign analysis that you do once the shooting starts, that's pretty easy. OR people do this all the time. They force on force kinds of stuff. Modeling and thinking about deterrence and what happens before the shooting starts, that's hard. And because it's hard, few people do it, and no one wants to do it, right? But we have Representative Gallagher from the state of Wisconsin has submitted language in the National Defense Authorization Act that changes the Title X mission of the Navy. When Commander McGrath was walking around talking to the other services, talking about this global system and system defense, and I would have really smart people in other services look at me and say, yeah, that's not your job. Title 10, right here. Operations, Incidents, and Combat at Sea, or whatever it is. Title 10 law has a very hard-edged statement on it. And as an action officer in the Pentagon and in Washington, I got routinely in endgame, saw the other services in OSD when it mattered to them, they would go back to that. And they'd say, well, yeah, but you don't need all that extra force structure for this present stuff because it's not here. It's not what it says in the law. So what Representative Gallagher has done is try to change the law. And the law places a heavy emphasis on the peacetime activities that the Navy does to contribute to security and prosperity. Does this mean, if it gets passed and it changes the law of the land, that the Navy's going to get a $27 billion top line increase next year? No. But it means no Iron Major from Air Force SAF AQ can ever walk into a room again in budget endgame and say to, one of you midshipmen, when you're an 04 or 05 fighting this battle 15 years from now, they won't be able to go back and say, yeah, but that's not your job. Because you'll be able to say, yeah, it is my job. It is our job.
So I think now I'd like to just open it up to questions from the audience. Go ahead and ask your question. I'll repeat it because we're mic'd up here for our later viewers on YouTube. But please, whatever strikes your mind. Commander Mewett.
I'm Ryan Mewett in the History Department. You mentioned the 1,000-ship Navy, and I was wondering how much the 1,000-ship Navy and the Regional Maritime Security Initiative before that actually informed in any concrete way the development of the strategy at the beginning point. Obviously, a lot of the principles were the same, but I'm curious if it played any meaningful role at all, or if it was just something that was out there.
And the question was about the connection between the 1,000-ship Navy or the global maritime partnerships and the strategy as it was written.
What it did was set top-level commanders' intent. There was no question where the CNO wanted things to go and in what direction. It had less significant impact on the content and the process.
Roger Bailey, also the History Department. It seems like with a like a wartime strategy, it's kind of going to be apparent quickly whether it's working or not working. And so I was wondering if with like a peacetime strategy that's designed to preserve the status quo, how people who are designing the strategies think about evaluating their successfulness, whether they're working.
Yeah, the question is, how do you know if it's working if it's in peacetime, not wartime?
I'm a little sarcastic. I mean, it's a 1 or a 0, right? Are we at war or not? That's a simplistic answer, and you deserve better. I think, to the extent that you could measure the success of the strategy that we put forward, you would try to look at how is the international system developed. We wrote this consciously to exert upward pressure on national strategy. This got me in trouble with a think tank guy named Bob Work, who eventually went on to be the Deputy Secretary of Defense. He was poking me in the chest in the Army Navy Club one day, telling me, but that's what we were doing. We were trying to change national strategy. So when I think about how I would have evaluated this, it would have been, were we moving money within the Department of Defense budget to buttress those activities that contribute to conventional deterrence and presence? Because there's a Venn diagram of these things. There are things in our arsenal that are really important, but they're really mostly important after the shooting starts. And we generally tend to resource those things fairly well. It's the other stuff that I was hoping to see money moving toward. And one of those things, it's capacity. Part of it is capacity. Part of it are, I was talking with somebody here earlier, ships that were somewhat simpler, that you could build in greater numbers and be in more places at once. Those were some of the things that I was looking for budgetarily that would have signaled that this was a success. None of it happened. None of it happened.
Sir, Bob Hewells from the History Department. So you mentioned that you wanted to keep this from becoming another document that went on the shelf. How did you approach that problem? What kind of efforts did you do to try and keep that from happening?
The question is, how do you keep the strategy from just going on the shelf afterwards?
It's easier now because you've got podcasts and YouTube and all sorts of channels to put that kind of work into. We had a little bit of a preemptive strategy. Admiral Morgan created this concept of the conversation with the country. And we set up a series of sort of day-long symposia around the world, around the country, where the strategy team would go and brief what we were working on. He would talk, the CNO would come, and we were trying to meet regular folks. Right? We were trying to appeal to, and John Morgan had this sense, God love him, that we were going to talk to garage mechanics and we were going to talk to bankers and dentists. And
how'd that go?
It didn't. It didn't. We talked to ourselves. The Navy Leaguers showed up. God love them. They're good people. They're bankers and car mechanics too. But they're already part of the thing. The thing with naval power and the thing with sea power in general, you see these Pew polls every year, and the Marines are always way up here, and the Air Force is way up here. Nobody knows what the Navy does. They see a movie every now and then where ships are shooting at each other, and they say, okay, that's cool. But what we need to do is to make sure that we are impacting the right people. The people who are in positions of authority and positions of influence, to influence how the money goes and how the thinking goes. The U.S. Navy is never going to have the PR that the Marines have. Ever. What we need to have is better communications and making sure we're talking to the right people, and that's something that I try to help with now. But as for keeping it from number one, it has to be readable. It has to be short. I think this is 20 pages or 22 pages or something like that.
About 5,000 words. It's not long.
Yeah, big type, lots of pictures. If you really want to read good strategy, you got to go into the high side, and where it's it's more sophisticated, and we were trying to sell a big idea here, trying to sell a big idea that was pushing up on the federal government to say that the Navy has a special role in the security and prosperity of the United States, the Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. That those things are what keep the plates spinning. Those are the things that keep the dollar as the reserve currency. Those are the things that keep American prosperity moving, right? I'm not trying to turn this into a capitalist manifesto here, but it was all about we get it. The Navy's going to fight somebody. We're going to shoot at you. We're going to kill you. You're going to kill, that's going to happen. But what are we doing with this Navy the 99% of the time that it's not fighting someone? And our suggestion was you get a lot of return for that investment. And that's what we tried with this.
Yeah, Michael.
Michael McCann, Nimitz Library. Sir, thank you so much for your insights. It's kind of like the inside baseball for how these strategies get developed.
Thank you.
I'm curious about the decision to include the Coast Guard for the first time in a long time, and whether you feel that was the significance of that inclusion of the Coast Guard, or was that, and how that maybe impacted your ability to sell it to Congress.
The question was about the inclusion of the Coast Guard finally in a maritime strategy.
Decision made way above my pay grade. In fact, before I even got hired on, the CNO had made it very clear that it was going to be a tri-service maritime strategy. I thought the Coast Guard brought a considerable amount to the deliberations, specifically with respect to the day-to-day business they do around the world in capacity building and the work that they do with mostly navies. There aren't that many countries that have Coast Guards, but they do a lot of missionary work around the world that doesn't get a lot of press. Building partner capacity, small diesel engine repair courses. I mean, they're doing stuff like that today all around the world. So having them in was good from the perspective of those day-to-day, underneath the level of conflict items that we had to make sure got in here. And we were writing shortly after, I think, Katrina. And there was, and the concept of humanitarian assistance and what we do. I remember there's a line in here that says something that we have this magnificent force that is ready at a moment's notice to respond to humanitarian crises, and in the process reinforce the idea that this force was purchased for far more violent ends, so that it could immediately turn on a dime. Their insistence or their advocacy for making sure we had that humanitarian assistance part in it was critical to that part of the document. I don't think it had an effect either way on Congress.
Just as an aside there, right? That's in the almost immediate aftermath of the tsunami in Indonesia also, right?
Yeah.
In 2004,
Yeah.
the Christmas tsunami.
Right. I mean, you've got, when these Marines are out there in those big ships and they got all kinds of extra power and they got water and there's all sorts of capability there that can help people in need. And I used to say, is that something we really need to do? Is it something American taxpayers ought to be paying for, right? To have this capacity there sailing around that can go help people when they get a hurricane? And my answer to that is no, we don't need to do that. But man, does it buy us a lot of goodwill? Does it buy us a lot of seats at tables? A lot of good relationships? The kind of stuff you need once the shooting does start. Hey, can I have that little piece of beach there to set up a expeditionary advance base? Those relationships are forged in peacetime, and they're lubricated by humanitarian assistance in the day-to-day business of diplomacy, naval diplomacy and otherwise.
Another question.
Is that a midshipman there in the corner? Right there, you. I'm pointing at you, the first guy, right there. Yeah. What's on your mind?
Well, sir, I would say, how do you think that this strategy has done so far in our relationship with China?
This strategy was not in any way, shape, or form. I mean, I went over to ONI and got some incredibly high intelligence briefs as part of this process. They refer to it as the crown jewels. There wasn't a whole lot to talk about China in 2005, 2006. There was some, wasn't a whole lot. So the strategy was, I used to think about all the time when there's a great quote about U.S. Grant. He's sitting there with his staff officers, and they're all talking about what Bobby Lee's going to do next, And Grant was like, why do you care what Bobby Lee's going to do next? What are you going to do, right? And this strategy was all about what are we going to do? It wasn't focused on an adversary. It was focused on what is the United States of America going to do and how should it do it to protect its place, its position of leadership, prosperity, economic might, all of those things in this world. Break. Now we have a threat to that. We have several threats to that we didn't have as clearly defined at that time. And I wonder, does this strategy stand up? It stands up from the perspective of making sure everyone understands that if it does come down to a fight with China, one of the things that's going to lead to positive outcomes is, how many friends do you have? What kind of system of alliances and operations and maritime domain awareness and all of the little things that happen during peacetime to help people in countries in the Western Pacific protect their fisheries, protect their treasuries, all of the things that go into the daily, all of that stuff that we're building every day has a place in a fight with China. So I think you can extend the ideas of this strategy to that fight. I think there are really important, more harder-edged thrusts that have to come up elsewhere to address that threat better. Thank you for that, though. Appreciate it.
Jared Dalton from the History Department, sir. Why do you think it was hard to sell all the other things navies do outside of the kinetic fight? When you look at just the U.S. Navy, and we haven't been ship to ship or any kind of major fleet engagement, anytime any of the politicians recently would know, so 80s, 90s, 2000s, all engagements were uncontested, delivery of humanitarian aid, uncontested deliverance of force, uncontested naval surface fires. So why would that be a hard sell to convince anyone that the Navy does a lot more than the kinetic fight, because that's really what we've seen for 40 years is a non-kinetic fight?
The question gets at the heart of this, what do navies do in peacetime? And because we've been showing it for 40 years, why is it hard to sell that? It's hard to sell that because when you get down to budget crunches and you have bombers and you have armored cavalry regiments and you have Marine Expeditionary Air Wings and you have destroyers and you have everybody fighting for the last dollar, and it is a fight. You have to go back to reference documents. You have to go back to what is it we're here to do, all right? And so when those Pentagon level discussions are happening, all of those things that the Navy and Marine Corps do around the world that we all appreciate become less appreciated because it means a bomber wing, or it means an armored cavalry regiment, or whatever things the Army does with, which I don't understand. So there is a don't believe your lying eyes. Don't believe that the presidents of the United States for 240 years have been using the Navy and Marine Corps as a temperature regulator and a systems admin device, as that guy from the War College used to say. I forget his name.
Barnett.
Yeah. Barnett. Tom Barnett used to refer to sysadmin function, right? I love that, right? That's what we do. We keep things going, right? We keep the plates spinning, and that's an important thing. When the plates start to fall, then we're going to shoot you, and we're going to hit you. But the shooting and hitting becomes valuable not because we can shoot you and hit you, but because we're there already. Because we're not getting this force underway from Fort Bragg or from Mildenhall or from wherever, because it's there. There is a virtue to that presence. Presence is not a mission. Please repeat after me. Presence is not a mission. Presence is something that enables missions. It gives you a faster response. It makes the other guy think twice about whether his aggression is going to work. That's what having those ships with all those missiles and all those Marines with guns, that's what that does. Hard to prove. Hard to prove. Can't prove the negative, right? But I always go back to the study of history, which is, okay, but I've got 200 and some odd years of history of us using it exactly for that purpose. When you come up upon a can sitting on a fence post, you could probably assume someone put it there, right? It's that kind of logic that applies. When we keep doing these things for centuries, It's not because people think it's ineffective. It's because political leaders believe that those forces are effective in keeping the lid on things or in providing response options should things get out of control.
Sir, Mission Northwest Handy. Please forgive me if I'm misinterpreting the strategy, but I see some similarities between this and the, I guess, Roosevelt-era doctrine of the Great White Fleet or the Big Stick diplomacy. So I was wondering how far back in, I guess, American naval doctrine did you have to borrow to come up with this one? How far back in history does this go?
Yeah. Again, personally, I came to this subject. This is the guy that wrote the book on Mahan, right? I came to the subject without having ever read a paragraph of Mahan. I was vaguely aware of the Great White Fleet, like any good American who's taken history classes should know. I don't think there was a lot of, at least in this brain, a lot of that historical input making its way in. But the benefit of having 16 other people in the room all the time, well, there were a lot of people who had read those things and could make those historical analogies. And when I would say something that was just a serious, just like a, hey, what do you think about this? They'd go, well, yeah, we did this we did this here in 1930, and we did this here in 1868, and blah, blah, blah. I was like, okay, well then I guess this is good. So it provide that sort of historical backup helped buttress the ideas. We didn't tie any of this to it in the footnotes or in the verbology. Thank you.
I'm kind of reminded of something that Peter Schwartz told me, who had been the lead author of the Maritime Strategy in the 1980s when he was a commander. And he said after it came out, a commentator told him, well, you've just replicated Mahan's Problem of Asia. And Peter said, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never read Problem of Asia. And then he went and read Problem of Asia and said, yeah, we just repeated what Mahan's Problem of Asia said. Right? So, yeah.
Peter Schwartz, God bless him, one of my favorite people in the world. And if you haven't met him, please try. He's one of the smartest people in the world, and he's an absolute national treasure. Peter Schwartz was on the Navy payroll when we were doing this, and he criticized us pretty strongly because it didn't mention the joint force, right? And that went right to one of my dental nerves, because I am one of the leading critics of uber jointness. I think it's important that armed services stick to their knitting, learn their competencies, and be good at their competencies. Jointness has a role. Jointness is really good when it comes to synchronizing forces in battle, but jointness isn't a strategy. Jointness isn't an acquisition path. Jointness is a way that you operate your force to create effects in combat. And the way we bring the joint force together operationally is the envy of the known world. And that's where I like to see jointness. A service strategy? Yeah, I didn't need. It's like, and I was very comfortable with Peter, and I told him he was crazy. I'm not going to put it in there.
So we're about out of time. The midshipmen are going to have to go to class here in a minute. Just as a note, remember all of our FINS events are up on YouTube, and you can find them on our website, including Sebastian Bruns' first bell lecture all about Peter Schwartz and all about his writing of the Maritime Strategy in the 1980s. And this will join that YouTube collection here shortly once we get it edited. Please join me in thanking Bryan for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.
And if anyone has any more questions, Bryan will hang out for a little bit if you've got more.